This video is going to be a bit different in that it's not the usual video essay that I would normally format it to be. I just got back from a quick trip to Universal Studios Hollywood and did Halloween Horror Nights there, and to my surprise, I was absolutely blown away by how good it was this year. I've been going to the event since 2022, and the first year I went, I actually thought it was really interesting just how different the house design is from Orlando. I did produce a video comparing the house design between both events and a few others, including Knott's Scary Farm and Hello Scream, if you want to check that out. But while Hollywood's house design came nowhere close to what the teams in Orlando were designing, I still felt that it was quite fun. However, in subsequent years, it continued to go from weaker house design to just outright bad house design, and last year for 2024, I was so underwhelmed by all the houses that I debated whether I should even bother with coming again this year. I was fully prepared to produce a video highlighting just how fundamentally flawed, and to be upfront, lazy, Hollywood's house design is, and yet I was surprised by the complete opposite. Orlando's event is excellent, and will always have a lot more detail in its houses because of their design team, but Hollywood this year really swayed me to their side, to the point where I actually think it might be the better event this year, which is why I wanted to produce this video. I just wanted to share some general thoughts between both events, but didn't really have enough to say for a full lengthy video, so that's why this is a bit different than usual. Also, if you'd like to support this video or the channel, you can also do me a favor by leaving a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed, I would appreciate that too, as I'm trying to hit 200,000 subscribers, or at least getting as close as I can, by the end of the year. In 2023, a narrative caught on the vlogging side of the internet that HHN Hollywood was actually better than Orlando. In some respects, yes. Like for example, the Chucky house for Hollywood was far superior to the Orlando version, which was just outright bad. And Stranger Things 4, while not very interesting on either coast, was still better in Hollywood due to just how obligatory the house felt in Orlando, with absolutely zero passion behind its design. People were also highlighting how much better The Last of Us was in Hollywood, which did have some fun novelty effects, but I otherwise don't think that's true, as the house design was still generally stronger in Orlando. I didn't buy into the narrative that Hollywood was better because Orlando just happened to have two bad houses that year, but for this year, 2025, I would actually argue that Hollywood legitimately stepped things up and has the more interesting house design. They still lack the depth of detail found in the Orlando houses, but I was really impressed by a lot of other aspects, so let's begin by comparing the houses that each event shares. Usually, if the events share an IP house, they attempt to portray a lot of the same scenes, but the interpretation is often very different, which makes comparing and contrasting each house interesting. However, I've never been in a house that's essentially beat for beat exactly the same, and weirdly, that's what Five Nights at Freddy's was this year, with both houses actually sharing the same exact room layout with only minimal differences. I've never seen that happen before, which makes me think there was an extra level of involvement from someone who produced the film or the studio that made the game, but while I think the house is pretty solid on both coasts, I just thought that it was worth noting just how incredibly similar they were, because that just never happens. The only real difference between them is that the opening scene in Hollywood only has one animated figure versus Orlando's 3, but otherwise, the puppetry and animatronics in Hollywood are significantly more fluid and work much better, which, unfortunately, Orlando has a lot of effects that stopped working after the first night. Moving on to Terrifier, both houses are excellent on both coasts, but the design is fundamentally different. I'll probably hold back on what I show when editing this, just because of the intense nature of the house, but in Hollywood, the focus is more on the horrific acts that take place in the films, with an emphasis on the gore. It feels a bit more like a tribute to the films, whereas the Orlando version has a lot of similar scenes, but goes in its own, more nebulous direction to create a house that feels a lot more playful. In Hollywood, the scare actors playing Art the Clown wear masks, but in Orlando, it's makeup and prosthetics, so you can better see how the scare actors emote. In general, the Orlando house feels a lot more playful, and you get more personal interaction with the actors. It also stands out because, while both houses have water effects to simulate getting splattered with blood, Orlando goes far beyond Hollywood, with the ending of the house allowing you to choose either the wet or dry path. Unfortunately, the wet path fails to deliver on the so-called Symphony of Blood, as you just walk down a black hallway with water streaming down, which is actually relatively easy to avoid if you just walk between the streams, but it does reinforce that this house's focus is more on creative fun than actually emphasizing specific scenes from the films. Each house on both coasts feels very distinct because they have different strengths, but both were excellent. When it was announced that Horror Nights would be getting a WWE house, I thought it was a really odd decision, because as big as WWE is, it still feels like a pretty niche thing to base a house on. In order to understand the house as best as I could, I watched a documentary on Peacock about Wyndham Rotunda, the man who created the character Bray Wyatt. But even so, it didn't really do much in terms of explaining the characters that you see in the house, so you really have to understand who they are beforehand to really get it. In Orlando, I like the house well enough, bringing these characters into the ring, where I've gotten some really good run-throughs with good scare actor interaction. However, in Hollywood, I found the house to be far better, which instead chooses to focus on the backstories of these characters, which is helped by putting them into their respective environments rather than the ring. It made for a much more visually dynamic house, and while I still can't really explain much about who these characters are, the context of this house did add to my understanding of them in a way that Orlando did not. Moving on to Fallout, I'm a pretty big fan of the games up through New Vegas, and I did think that the show was really well written, so I was curious to see how this would translate to Halloween Horror Nights. Unfortunately, the house in Orlando is very clearly the weakest this year, as it reminds me a lot of Stranger Things 4, in that it just feels obligatory and has no love put into it. The house just goes through some of the scenes from the show, and it's just not interesting. In Hollywood, however, it shares some scenes and chooses others that are absent from Orlando, but it still feels like there is a lot more passion put into it. I was really impressed with some of the sets, especially the massive Yao Guai puppets, which puts this house easily above Orlando. It's weird that it ends abruptly, really only covering I think like the first 4 or 5 episodes, but it takes the limited material that it chooses to work with and created something far more interesting than its Orlando counterpart. The final shared house between both events is Jason Universe, which in my opinion is just downright bad in Florida. I see people raving about this house for no reason that I can understand, but I find it really boring when the first 3/4 of the house is just the same scare and the same nondescript version of Camp Crystal Lake over and over and over and over again, which just doesn't make for an interesting house. Compared to the other Orlando houses, the scare actors are just going through the motion and aren't very aggressive, so you don't really get good interaction with them, and the last quarter of the house is what I've seen people describe as the Gauntlet, where you move through 4 straight hallways where different versions of Jason from later films just pop out at you. I suppose if you're scared easily, maybe you'll like this house if that's all you're looking for, but I go for the set design and storytelling, and this house just feels outright boring to me. In contrast, I was really happy with the version in Hollywood because it took the same concept, essentially going through Camp Crystal Lake, but adding more distinct scenes and sets with a larger variety of scares, using the entire house to progressively show different versions of Jason rather than just a straight hallway at the end. It's rare that Hollywood houses ever do better than the Orlando versions, but I was really impressed with Hollywood this year and how it managed to design better houses. Terrifier is strong on both coasts, but just with different strengths, and Five Nights at Freddy's were essentially both identical, but Fallout, WWE, and now Jason Universe were significantly better in Hollywood, making its IP houses really strong for this year. Well, at least with the exception of Poltergeist. I don't know if this house was just done last minute, but half of it is just black painted hallways, which isn't interesting at all. Orlando's 2018 version of Poltergeist might be one of the best houses I've ever done, so this was all the more disappointing. Comparing original houses between the event, this is usually where Hollywood is weaker, and this year only had 2. The first is Scarecrow the Reaping, music by Slash, which is the second time that Hollywood is attempting to do this house. Scarecrow first premiered as an original house in Orlando in 2017, and stands as one of the greatest houses ever designed for that event. So when I first went to Hollywood in 2022 and saw that they were recreating the house, I was very excited. However, that house was just downright awful compared to Orlando, which is interesting because people were praising how good it was, but it lacked detail as you were just going through a lot of blank hallways, which is an issue that Hollywood house design often suffers from, at least prior to 2025. So for this year, they brought the house back with, I think, a lot more detail, and so I actually enjoyed it. However, their big marketing gimmick is that Slash produced the music for the house, which just doesn't really add much. In terms of design, it's a pretty middle-of-the-road experience that I thought was fun, but the background guitar riffs aren't the focus, and so, while not bad, is more gimmick than something that contributes to making the house better. The other original house is Monsters 3, Monsters of Latin America, and ever since they've been producing this house, it has easily been the best every single year without fail. I have no idea if it's the same lead designer on every single house, but I have very little to say other than it's strong every year. It's detailed, has impressive sets and effects, always has aggressive scare actors, and features Latin American horror stories that make for interesting variety at the event. Looking at Orlando's original houses, it was a bit mixed on these this year, but they're all still generally pretty good. The weakest, in my opinion, is Gulken Monsters of the North, which is a house focused on the story of a Norwegian village where a shamanistic monster draws in other horrors and grows bigger as she brings them into her body. I think that a Norse mythology themed house is inherently interesting, but the execution is just kind of okay here. I have nothing else to say other than I enjoy it for what it is, but I think it's overall forgettable despite some interesting elements here and there. The next house, which is somewhat interchangeable with Gulken in terms of quality, is Hatchet and Chain's Demon Bounty Hunters. This was a really good segment of Slaughter Cinema 2 from last year, and was a highlight of that house, but it doesn't translate as well into its own thing. It certainly has noteworthy scenes, but overall comes off as a bit generic with a convoluted story that's a bit difficult to pick up on. The thing that puts it above Gulken for me is that the scare actors are a lot more aggressive, and you do get some more personalized interactions outside of the scare triggers, since the house is more open and you see the scare actors more clearly. Above these two houses in third place is Grave of Flesh, which I didn't really like the first time I went through, as I didn't really understand its point. But as I've gotten more run-throughs, I've come to appreciate its intent a lot better. Essentially, this house takes you from your grave and down further and further, entering an underground dimension of hell that reminds me a lot of Dante's Inferno. The sets can often look similar as you progress through the house, but on repeat experiences, I've noticed a lot of its nuance as you descend into a stone fortress, something that reminds me a lot of 1980s dark fantasy movies. There's also a lot of really well-placed scares in here for good interaction with the scare actors, so this one has really grown on me, but is something that I think requires multiple runs to really appreciate. The second best house in my opinion is Dahl's Let's Play Dead, which I often see people ranking at the bottom of their list this year, but I think they're missing the point. I see people complain that it's not scary, but this is clearly meant to be comedic. It's a house that really leans into body horror without blood and gore, and has a ton of variety between the different scenes, which is a big contributor to what makes house design interesting to me. It's just pure fun with a lot of comedic moments. While I don't think it's the best, it is my favorite, but I think that the actual best house, both in terms of the originals and for the event overall, is El Artista: A Spanish Haunting. If you're a fan of Horror Nights, you'll probably recall Dead Man's Pier from 2022, and for many people, this is undeniably the best house that they had ever been through in terms of beautiful set design. I did think that the scares were a bit pedestrian and lacked variety, but the scale of the house and its sets more than made up for it. However, while 2023's Blood Moon also had impressive sets, which many people compared to Dead Man's Pier, for me, El Artista is the first house to really rival it. It doesn't quite reach the same scale, although it is still massive, but the variety between the scenes makes for a house that I think is arguably better than Dead Man's Pier. The story is that of an artist who moves into a secluded country manor in Spain, but the site is haunted, with the evil of the house influencing his paintings, which come to life in an epic haunting. There's a ton of variety between the scenes and the types of scares, ranging from a gargoyle flying overhead suspended from a wire, and to a courtyard with some really clever scares, including a soldier who distracts from a cleverly hidden vine creature, and a scare actor posing as a statue that I often see gets people pretty effectively. If I have one issue with the house, is that the ending is really abrupt, but I think that this is arguably not only one of the most interesting houses I've ever experienced, but personally tops Dead Man's Pier for me. Overall, Orlando is very strong this year, but is held down by two bad houses, Fallout and Jason Universe. However, I can't believe that I really came out of Hollywood thinking that it was better, but other than Poltergeist, I was impressed and felt that it actually has the edge this year. Terrifier and Five Nights at Freddy's are strong at both events, but Wyatt Six is far more fleshed out in Hollywood, and Fallout and Jason are actually really good there. I think that Orlando's event in 2024 goes underappreciated, which has the strongest house lineup that I've ever seen for the event, as in there wasn't a single bad house last year. Some of them were not exceptional, but all had very interesting ideas. Yet, all I saw was people ragging on the event as one of the worst years ever, and I think that a large part of that is due to how lacking the scare zones were. There was a lot of speculation that this was due to budget cuts because of Epic Universe being constructed, but I'm glad to say that for 2025, the scare zones are significantly better and much stronger. Maybe it's a bigger budget, or maybe it's Universal listening to feedback about how underbuilt they were last year, or maybe it's a mix of both. But the atmosphere of the park outside of the houses is excellent, and intrigues even me, when usually, I just don't find scare zones to be all that interesting. In Hollywood, they've essentially done the same thing that they always do, with the first scare zone featuring something silly with a roving chainsaw horde, and the second being based around Latin American horror, which is all fine, but just isn't too remarkable when you've done it for the last 4 years. Also, there's Murder of Crows for the second time in a row right in front of the Fast and Furious coaster being constructed, which is also barely even a scare zone. Hollywood does have the edge on Orlando with the Terror Tram, which is just kind of okay, but is a unique experience that I've never seen elsewhere, so that's a plus for the event as well. Even so, the house design for Hollywood has the edge for me this year, which is really surprising when I was ready to write it off after just how awful it was in 2024, expecting that I was going to make a video about the decline of the event and how it needs major changes to the design team. However, I'm glad to say that I liked it a lot, and while I didn't really have an angle to produce a more focused video with a strong thesis, I just wanted to share my thoughts on both events this year as they're both really good. If you've been to one of these or both, let me know your thoughts because I'm curious to read them, and if you would like to support this video, please leave a like if you haven't already. As always, if you haven't yet subscribed and hit the bell icon yet either, you can also do so now to be alerted to new videos as they're released.